Good morning. This is Drew Bartlett, Executive Director of the South Florida Water Management District, and welcome to the WRAC Public Forum on Thursday, May 28th via Zoom webinar. I'm glad everybody has been able to join us today. Looks like we have 118 participants, which is fantastic because we want to talk about an important topic today at the forum. So basic housekeeping, welcome and thank you. Obviously, we're doing this remotely because of COVID-19 and for the safety of all the participants. And we've been using Zoom technology for a little while now, and I think we've gotten pretty good at it. So hopefully everyone agrees. For members of the public who wish to comment, you can use your raise hand feature in Zoom. If members of the public are having trouble and need help, you can go to our website and click on the Ask Us button at the top of the page. That's sfwmd.gov, and we can help you with the technology. Of course, we'll take public comment at the end of the meeting, and you can always submit your comments using the same Ask Us button on the website. For the WRAC members, I'm going to ask you to also use the raise hand feature during the meeting. And when speaking, please state your name for the record. That goes for any public commentor. So I have two presentations, and we're going to hold the WRAC discussion until the end of each presentation. And so again, use the raise hand button for if you want me to recognize you. If you're on the phone and would like to comment, then you need to press *9 to raise your hand and use *6 to mute and unmute. So I'll call on you with *9, and then you would need to hit *6 to unmute your phone. And of course, public comments will be taken during the public comments section at the end of the agenda. So I say let's get on with the agenda. So we are going to talk about vegetation management, and we've got two presentations today. One by Leroy Rogers, who's our invasive species section leader and also happens to be our Employee of the Year, although he doesn't take credit for it. He gives all that to his team. But he'll bring a great overview of the importance of controlling invasive plants and the practices that we do that with. And so that's kind of a backgrounder. Francois LaRoche will provide an overview of some of the enhancements we're trying to do to our vegetation management system, really in response to the public interest in reducing dependence on herbicides. So we at the district have been looking at various ways to go about making sure we control our exotics, which is absolutely necessary, but also reducing the use of herbicides in our systems where we need to control those exotics and the spread of invasives. The main purpose of this WRAC discussion is the discussion on the enhancement strategy and the interest and the thoughts that the public and the WRAC members have on this strategy. So Leroy Rogers is a backgrounder, but Francois is where we get the ideas flowing, okay? But if you have any questions for Leroy or Francois, certainly we'll happy to take those from the WRAC members after each presentation. So Leroy, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to you to start us off with the first presentation. Thank you, and take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Drew, for the introduction, and let me see if I can get control here of the presentation. Yes, and thank you everybody online. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, invasive species, today to the WRAC participants and members of the public, and probably more importantly, to engage in some dialogue on our continued efforts to enhance our program that we've been working on for a number of years. To give a quick overview of my presentation, what I hope to accomplish here, to begin with, I will give a high-level overview of invasive plant species and their impacts, primarily from a district perspective, how these invasive and sometimes nuisance vegetation impacts the district's mission. Then I'll go through and give you some another overview of the control tools that we have at our disposal and that we use for vegetation management at the district, and then spend some time talking about the strategies, how we pull all of that together into a cohesive program. And it's my hope that at the end of the presentation, there'll be two terms that everyone is familiar with: integrated pest management and maintenance control. These are key tenets to our strategy and critical for our long-term success of the program. So the district, our vegetation management program at the district has a diverse set of program objectives that fall into three areas in support of the district mission. We want to protect the progress of Everglades restoration efforts from the encroachment and impacts of invasive species. We want to protect our flood protection and water delivery system from nuisance vegetation and invasives. And one of our flagship programs here at the district, the stormwater treatment areas, rely heavily on our program to optimize vegetation to achieve maximum removal of phosphorus from those constructed wetland systems. So we have quite a lot to do in our program. There are two terms that you'll hear me and later Francois mention several times, and there's often confusion in their meetings, so I thought it'd be good to start with some definitions. When we speak of invasive exotic species, we're referring to species that are not native to a given area, and in this context, South Florida, that when present cause or are likely to cause economic or environmental harm, or in some cases harm to human health. Another term that you'll hear is referred to as nuisance vegetation. These are typically native plant species that for whatever reason have become problematic. Maybe they've become starting to have invasive type behaviors. And typically this is due to some other disturbance. A classic example of that would be the native cattail, which is a wetland plant that due to heavy nutrient loading in the northern parts of the Everglades has become a dominant and very aggressive plant and interferes with wildlife habitat functions in those parts of the Everglades. In other cases, vegetation may just simply interfere with the infrastructure and needs to be managed. So many are aware that South Florida is rather famous for a wide variety of invasive species issues. Of course, in recent years, several invasive animals have become the center of a lot of attention, but there are a lot of reasons why invasive species and particularly invasive plants do so well in South Florida. We have a very mild climate with a very long growing season, of course. And with that, we have a lot of international commerce with 3 major port cities in the state, a very vigorous ornamental plant industry, and very dense human population centers. And all these together juxtaposed against these large, sensitive wildlands and natural landscapes makes for a rather perfect storm for biological invasions. And South Florida has the dubious distinction of being one of the most affected areas in the United States with regard to invasive plants. But it's important to note that all exotic plants are not necessarily bad or become problematic for the district. To illustrate this point, we put together some numbers on the number of naturalized non-native plant species within the 16-county region that represents the district's boundaries. And we currently have 1,005 documented naturalized non-native plants. Of those, only 76 are considered by the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council to be what are called Category 1 invasive species. These are species that are documented to readily invade Florida's natural areas and cause harm to those ecosystems. Of those 76 species within the district, only 18 are currently widely established or locally abundant on district managed lands and waterways and cause significant problems. And these 18 species are what ecologists often call ecosystem engineers, in that they inflict profound changes on the ecosystem to the point where key structure and processes are completely altered from the native state. So what are these impacts to the ecosystem that we experience in South Florida? Overall, especially with the case of these ecosystem engineers, we see that the proliferation of these species leads to a significant alteration of structure and process. And these photographs up on the top of the screen illustrate that very well. You see on the left a typical pristine Everglades landscape with open water marshes and sloughs and scattered tree island habitat. And on the right, a former Everglades marsh that has been completely overrun by the famous Australian tree Melaleuca. You can see from the photo that we, as a result of this complete dominance of the plant, that we see a loss of native flora and fauna. We see severe degradation of wildlife habitat. Those species that are already endangered become increasingly endangered. And we also see impacts to our operations and restoration infrastructure as a result of these invasions. It's not just in natural areas that are impacted. Our infrastructure at the district is often impacted by invasive and nuisance species. Here you can see dense floating mats of invasive exotic plants on the left upstream of a outflow structure in one of our STAs. And on the right, this is a relatively newcomer to Florida, once in the aquatic plant industry for terrariums and aquariums, Rotala, which has become very abundant in Miami-Dade County in our canals. And you can see by the excessive growth that it can really impede the amount of water flow capacity that we have in that system. Impacts can also be very direct to our infrastructure, as shown here in these photos from St. Lucie County, where accumulated vegetation in an upstream canal not managed by the district came through after a storm event and was actually able to take out a farmer's bridge just from the sheer mass of all the biomass coming through the canal system. And finally, vegetation has to be managed on our levee system to ensure that levee inspection standards mandated by the Army Corps of Engineers are maintained so that we can inspect and verify the integrity of our levee system. So that's a kind of a quick overview of the overall impacts that we see from invasive plant species. I want to take some time to talk about a few notable, or I suppose notorious, South Florida invasive plants, and dig into a little bit more detail on the impacts that they cause. And the first species is actually not a species, but a complex of species that we typically refer to as floating aquatic weeds or floating aquatic vegetation. In Central and South Florida, these are predominantly two species that are invasive exotics, water hyacinth and water lettuce. As you can see from the photo, once these plants are rapidly reproduce and quickly dominate open water habitats. And when they do so, they significantly reduce the growth of native aquatic plants, particularly submerged aquatics, clearly impede navigation. They produce quite a bit of sediment, which can be problematic for water quality. And in our STA program, these are considered very undesirable because they strongly impact the health of vegetation that we need to remove phosphorus from the system. A little more detail on the impacts to aquatic system from floating aquatics. It begins usually with these plants are already invasive, but it's aggravated by the fact that many of our water bodies in Florida have higher nutrient concentrations, which accelerate the growth of these weeds. Once they become pretty much dominant on the top of the water column, as shown in the bottom graphic, we see a sharp decrease in native plant and animal diversity. And importantly, we see a reduction in the abundance of desirable submerged aquatic plants, which have many environmental benefits. We see changes to water quality and food web dynamics and changes in fish populations. And importantly, we see an accumulation of unstable organic sediments. Once you have a very dense stand of these floating aquatics, because of their high turnover rate, plants come and die very quickly. You end up with a heavy accumulation of sediments that are easily resuspended into the water column when we have wind action or boating activity, and can really cause long-term effects to overall water quality. Another aquatic weed that's very well known globally is hydrilla. It's considered one of the worst aquatic weeds in the world, and we certainly have plenty of it here in Florida. As you can see from the photo here, this is not actually within the district. This is just north of Ocala at Lake Ocklawaha. Left unmanaged, hydrilla can aggressively fill an entire water body and displace native submerged aquatic plants. Importantly for us, hydrilla can significantly slow the flow of water and very much so clogs water control structures. So it's a really big problem for us when we're trying to do flood control and water supply. Obviously, dense hydrilla mats will interfere with boating, swimming, and fishing, and certainly has impacts, documented impacts on sport fish weight and size. And again, as with most of these aggressive weeds, we see changes to water chemistry and other and oxygen levels. Moving into natural areas and wetlands, I chose Old World Climbing Fern as our representative weed for those types of habitats. This is a climbing fern, as the name implies, native to Southeastern Asia, that is extremely problematic in South Florida and Central Florida. The plant, as you can see from the photo, if you're able to see the gentleman standing there, the scale of the infestation, this plant rapidly blankets all of the native plant communities, degrades wildlife habitat, and particularly insidious aspect of the invasion of Old World Climbing Fern is that the plant is very flammable, and it will typically invade areas that are not necessarily adapted to fire. And this heavy biomass that's very flammable can allow wildfires to go into these areas that otherwise cannot tolerate fire and completely destroy the plant community. It's also very difficult to control plant, particularly because it gets established in very remote areas, and it's very hard to get into those areas to do control. And the last species that I'll profile here is what's known as a cane grass called Napier grass. It's native to Africa and is distributed around the world. Here it most commonly dominates disturbed upland areas. So anywhere you've had some disturbed soil, roadside or anything like that, this plant will come in, and as you can see from the photo, it forms these very dense thickets, completely displacing native plant communities and wildlife habitat. But for the district, for the most part, this is a major issue for us on our levees, where it proliferates and becomes very expensive to control, and particularly with regard to maintaining our inspection standards for our levee system. So that was a quick fly through on a few of the species that we're dealing with. Now I want to talk a little bit about the control tools that the district has available for managing all of these species. They break down into 5 categories, and I'll go through each one of these individually, but it's important to note that the district tries to have as many tools in our toolbox as possible, but unfortunately, many times we're very limited on which tools we actually have available to us for a given species. And as you'll see shortly, we often will try to do combinations of these different tools to get optimal results. So prevention, it doesn't sound like a tool, but really it is a very important part of controlling the spread of invasive plants, and we try to get involved with a number of prevention activities at the district. We have decontamination protocols of equipment. This is the concept of just making sure that you're cleaning equipment before you go to site so that you're not unintentionally spreading hitchhiker plants. In many parts of the country where aquatic weeds are a problem, you'll see decontamination recommendations at boat ramps for the public to use so that they're not transferring these weeds as well. The district has a number of biologists that are trained to know what some of these new critical invaders are. And when we do identify those through our regular monitoring, we try to do rapid response to those introductions. Obviously, it makes sense to deal with new populations before when they're small, rather than waiting until they're a big widespread problem that will cost a lot of resources to control. Risk assessments are a big part of prevention, and the district is not taking the lead on that, but we do support other agencies that develop these predictive models to help determine which new species that are coming into the state might become serious invasives. And having these risk assessment tools, such as the one from the University of Florida, which has really helped us hone in on the species that we need to focus on the most. And those risk assessments, of course, inform and help with the regulation efforts and public awareness. Of course, prevention is only as successful as the involvement of the public and stakeholders. And for this reason, the district does spend quite a bit of time with outreach to help educate the public and others on the issue of spreading these invasive plants around the ecosystem. Biological control is, generally speaking, the use of other organisms to reduce an invasive plant population. There are different types of biological control. One program that we have is use of sterile grass carp, the fish, to consume aquatic weeds in our canal system. And Francois is going to talk a little bit about this in his presentation. And that's been a very effective way for us to reduce the growth of nuisance vegetation. A more specific type of biological control is known as classical biological control. And here we're looking, we have researchers that go and identify insects typically that have so tightly co-evolved with the target weed in question that they will only feed on that species. If that species is not present, the insect population dies out. And it's been a very effective way to help control a number of weeds in South Florida. It's wonderful because once we can get approval of one of these and release them into the environment, they are self-sustaining. They do their work without us having to go back and augment them. Importantly, it's important to note that these biocontrol agents do not necessarily eradicate invasive species. They just reduce the competitive nature of these invasive species, sort of putting them on the level playing field by reintroducing them from their co-evolved enemies, if you will, that they had from their homeland. Biological control, while often effective, does take a lot of research, especially classical biological control, because we must ensure that there will be no adverse impacts from releasing these insects. So there are years of research to make sure that these are safe agents, and the approval process, both at the state and federal level, does take time. So it can take quite a bit of time to get a successful biological program in place. Mechanical control is a widely used tool at the district. It comes in many forms, and it's essentially the physical removal of invasive or nuisance vegetation. Typically, the district utilizes harvesters and shredders, and we have those both for aquatic and upland applications. Mechanical harvesting is wonderful because we can get immediate removal of large quantities of biomass from the system. And by removing it, that minimizes the decomposing plants in the water column that can be a problem. There are some concerns, and you have to take care to minimize water column and sediment disturbances when doing operations like this. And of course, you have to deal with large quantities of biomass to be disposed from. And there are also some concerns about the spread of vegetation from fragmentation. So when we go in and do these mechanical removal efforts, we end up with a lot of fragments of these plants, and they can quickly move downstream and reinfest other areas. So that's something we have to take care with. And of course, potential non-target damage. The mechanical harvesters have to take care not to remove the desirable vegetation that we're trying to promote through those operations. Chemical control, of course, is the use of EPA-approved herbicides that act on specific metabolic functions of plants. And Francois is going to go into this in much more detail, but we have a number of herbicides that we use that are applied by ground applicators, typically from truck or boat or on foot, say with backpack sprayers or spray bottles. And in some cases, we also use aerial platforms for infestations that are very large, where there are no non-target plants of concern or very little, or the infestations are in extremely remote areas that we cannot get equipment or ground crews into. Considerations with regard to chemical control is, sometimes they're very effective for selective invasive plant control. We can actually remove a target invasive plant with having minimal impacts to native desirable vegetation. Public interest, of course, there's concern about the use of herbicide, and we want to make sure that we're addressing those stakeholder concerns with regard to herbicides. And in some cases, not all herbicides are selective. In fact, most are general. So we have to be very careful about non-target impacts when using herbicides. And for this reason, we really focus on improving the precision of the application to minimize those non-target effects. Cultural controls involves a wide variety of different management practices that we employ that are designed specifically to stress the invasive plant in some way. Common examples at the district for our program are the utilizing prescribed fire. Through our best management practices program, we manage nutrient inputs. Heavy nutrients often make invasive species much more aggressive. So having that regulatory function to reduce nutrients has been very helpful. Water depth changes. We can change the depth of water in some cases to stress the invasive plant and use that in combination with other control efforts. And in many cases, the district does active planting of desirable plant species to help control invasives. And in the photo on the right, you can see a ground crew that's planting the native giant bulrush in an open water area. This is actually in one of our STAs where we're trying to get a lot of submerged aquatic vegetation for water quality improvement. And by installing these vegetation strips, if you will, we can compartmentalize the area and minimize the flow of the harmful floating aquatic vegetation, kind of consolidate them into certain areas. Okay, so that was a quick flyby of all the control tools that we used. I'd like to close the presentation by talking about how we bring all this together into one cohesive strategy at the district. And I'll skip over the first three because I've really, well, the first two bullets, we've talked about prevention and rapidly responding to new threats. Those are important parts of our strategy. Coordination is also a big part of our program. Invasive plants, as we say, do not recognize fence lines or trespassing signs. And so they move freely across the landscape. And for that reason, it's important that we actively communicate and coordinate with our neighbors. And that involves both interagency partners, but also other entities that are managing property. And we've found that by sharing information and having frequent communication, we can really help build on each other's programs as opposed to stepping on each other's feet or undoing another person's effort. What I want to focus on with the veg management strategy, again, are the two concepts I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The idea of integrating our available control tools to achieve optimal results. That's called integrated pest management, and maintaining invasive plants at the lowest feasible level and the benefits that come from this, which we call maintenance control. So what is IPM? Integrated pest management. Here, we showed you all the tools that we use. IPM is simply strategically integrating those tools to improve the outcome. Here we're looking for synergistic benefits. We want an outcome that's better than the sum of the parts of these different control efforts. And through experience, we have found that by integrating these tools, we can greatly reduce the quantity and frequency of herbicide applications. And as you'll see in a moment, we're starting to see a lot of results of that by the benefits of IPM. This graphic just kind of shows how we might incorporate a number of these different tools from our toolbox to target on an individual species. And I'd like to talk briefly about one specific case that we're very proud of here in South Florida, and that's the IPM program for Melaleuca. Numerous agencies have worked hard to develop a control program that integrates all of these tools, and we've had amazing results from this effort. A typical IPM approach to Melaleuca will start with the initial herbicide treatments for these very dense populations. Once we've got the population reduced and we start getting a recruitment of native vegetation, we will often use prescribed fire to promote both promote the native species that are adapted to fire, but also help reduce the vigor and aggressive growth of Melaleuca. We have a number of biological control agents that are now available for Melaleuca, and they are doing a really great job at minimizing the productivity or the growth rate of Melaleuca, and they seem to really do well, especially after prescribed fire events. And with those events, we get to a point where we can simply go through, and in the bottom right photo, you can see widely scattered Melaleuca that the ground crews are just going in and doing precise applications of herbicide, or when we get there soon enough, we can also do hand pulling and just remove the small saplings from the ground. So this has been a very successful program. And to kind of hammer the point home, I always like to show this slide because it's just so profound. What you're looking at here are photos of 2 experimental plots from Southwest Florida, an area that had Melaleuca, and a fire went through this area, and researchers with the USDA Agricultural Research Service established plots where in some plots, as shown on the left, they applied a pesticide to actually remove the biological control agents that were present on the site. And on the right, they just, you know, they let the biocontrol agents do what they want. And in a short amount of time, I believe this is just 2.5 years later after the fire, you can see the effect very clearly of having these biological control agents in the field. Melaleuca is not eradicated. It is still there, but you can see the difference in the abundance and the health of the plants. And this greatly reduces the amount of time, effort, and herbicide that we have to use as a follow-up treatment. And also increases the amount of time before we need to go in there and do those follow-up treatments. And the next concept is maintenance control. And this is really our ultimate goal in vegetation management here at the district. The concept is that we emphasize retreatment to keep the invasive plant populations at the lowest possible level. Through this experience, we found that we use less herbicide to treat. We see that the invasive plant is much easier to manage. We have lower ecosystem disturbances resulting from the management activity, whatever that activity might be. And we have an overall improved habitat condition as a result. And you can see the photo on the bottom right there that shows the widely scattered Melaleuca in Water Conservation Area 3A, where Melaleuca was once very dense and very abundant. And to give you another example of maintenance control from the standpoint of cost and herbicide utilization, pulled these numbers together. This graph is a little bit noisy, but in short, what we're seeing here is 2 areas, Water Conservation Area 1 on the left and Water Conservation Area 3A on the right. Water Conservation Area 1 is not what we would consider under maintenance control. Most areas do not get treated, haven't historically been treated more frequently than 10 years. And the area that was treated in fiscal year 19, you can see that we spent quite a bit of money, $40 an acre, and used 3,200 gallons of herbicide to treat an area just over 20,000 acres. And that's because, of course, the plants are very dense. It takes a lot of time to move through and remove the abundant plants that are there. You compare that with Water Conservation Area 3A on the right, where we have maintenance control, and you can see the large number of acres that we're able to sweep with our ground contractors. And in orange, which shows the acres that were treated with herbicide, is just a small fraction of the area that we swept. And by the numbers, you see that we used an order of magnitude less herbicide, just under 300 gallons, at a cost of only 50 cents an acre. So this is clear evidence that achieving maintenance control makes sense both fiscally and environmentally on a number of fronts. And this will be my last data slide, and then I'll close up here. But when we started looking at our program to see how we were doing with the current efforts to reduce herbicide and be more efficient, we looked back at the last 10 years of our program. And what you're seeing in this graph in the blue vertical bars are the total acres that our ground service contractors swept looking for invasive plants district-wide. So this will be for the entire district by calendar year. And the orange data points are showing you the total quantity of herbicides in pounds active ingredient per acre applied in each of those fiscal years. So the take-home message that you probably see in this trend is that while the number of acres that we've swept has fluctuated, gone up and down, there's a very strong trend of reduced rate of herbicide on an acre basis for our program over the last 10 years, which is pretty remarkable. And this is a testament, in my opinion, and looking at the numbers, to the greater amount of maintenance control that we're achieving on our properties and the continued integration of these additional control tools. So in summary, invasive plants are clearly, hopefully I convinced you that they're a significant threat to the district's mission, very problematic, and represent a diverse array of threats to our program. The district has a very vigorous veg management program that strategically applies multiple control tools. And we have found through experience that our optimal results are achieved by using this IPM approach, and that reaches hopefully maintenance control for most of our properties. And that is my presentation.
Thank you, Leroy. Well done. This is Drew. And at this point, I'd like to open it up to RAC members that may have questions on the basics of exotics control. Let's save any ideas or suggestions or anything you have on what the district could do till after Francois' presentation. But any kind of basics questions, I'm certainly happy to entertain those now. So Yvette, are you going to facilitate that, or I will? I see Gary has his hand up. So Gary, if you're unmuted, go ahead and ask a question.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Leroy, great presentation, great overview on this. And you, I guess I have just a couple of questions, but the first one kind of involves the very end of your discussion when you talked about coordination between agencies. And you know, the one of the missions is the ability to protect the Everglades. And many people have questions about the various responsibilities of DEP, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the Water Management District, and where their boundaries kind of stop in terms of vegetation control. Who is, you know, responsible for what particular areas? And I know that over the past several years, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has been highly criticized for their vegetation management program in Lake Okeechobee. Some of it warranted, some of it maybe not so warranted. But I'm kind of interested more in how the coordination between DEP, Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the Water Management District throughout the entire system in an overall plan to protect the Everglades in water quality, because it appears that the Water Management District is really doing more mechanical harvesting than, you know, maybe Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And of course, it becomes difficult to do mechanical harvesting in Lake Okeechobee. Obviously, there's logistical problems and things of that nature. And then, you know, with the mechanical harvesting, you mentioned you accumulate a great deal of biomass. What exactly do you do with that biomass once you've removed it from the water column?
Roy, I'll leave that to you to answer. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Good questions, Gary. And yeah, your question on coordination is a big one. And I can start by telling you that that all agencies that are involved down here in invasive species management we're one of the most communicative groups that I've encountered in government. We do work very closely together, particularly at the staff level. And sometimes these are informal coordinations, other times rather formal. There are numerous ways that we coordinate. Some are specific to a particular province of the system, and a good example of that is that the Everglades Forever Act actually mandates the South Florida Water Management District coordinate invasive species management within the Everglades natural areas, essentially the Everglades protection area. And through that mandate, the district has worked closely with other agencies over the years since 1994 to do that kind of coordination, where we discuss, what are the strategies that you're employing, what's working for you, what's not working, can we find opportunities to work across fence lines and leverage our resources. And it's been very successful. In fact, that's grown into a nationally recognized organization known as the Everglades Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area that does just a fantastic job of doing that type of coordination. Now, that's more for the natural areas. There are other coordinating bodies for other parts of the system, and Lake Okeechobee is a good example of that, where agencies work together. And I'm going to ask Francois to, if you don't mind, since you've been more involved with Lake Okeechobee coordination, if you want to say a few words about that.
Yes, as far as Lake Okeechobee, by the way, this is Francois LaRoche. Lake Okeechobee has an interagency group which is composed of the Florida Fish and Wildlife, the Corps of Engineer, and the district. We have a memorandum of agreement to discuss how invasive species are managed in the lake. However, FWC has the lead role, but we do bi-monthly meetings to discuss those activities. And recently, we've been doing more mechanical control in the lake, and we're coordinating with Lake Okeechobee, and I will discuss a little bit of that in my presentation. As far as the question on what do we do with the biomass, that's one of the major issues with mechanical harvesting. And currently, we are depositing the excess biomass on spoil islands within the lake, and we've been coordinating with DEP and the Corps to determine where to deposit these amount of biomass. So overall, as far as the chemical treatment, FWC guides those treatments, and they coordinate with the Corps and the district.
All right.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The next RAC member with a hand up is Richard Pinsky.
Okay, thank you very much. I do want to come back and revisit that answer and what Gary raised, but this particular portion of the presentation, the fire burn was intriguing to me. So obviously, if it's accidental lightning or something happens, there's not much that the district can do about that. But on the prescribed burn and the management side of the burning, what happens? I guess the first part of the question would be, what happens if there is an accidental fire? Does that impact? It doesn't seem like it would impact greatly your strategy, but how do you balance it with the air quality controls that are in place? Are we decreasing the amount of burning? Is it a substantial part of our strategy? Can you drill down a little bit more on the burning?
Yeah, sure. I'd happy to. This is Leroy again. Yeah, so the application of prescribed fire is rather a complex venture with regard to invasive species management. As you're probably aware, most of the, well, not most, but a lot of the ecosystems in Florida are adapted to fire, and in fact will succeed to other habitats if you don't have periodic fire in there. So fire is a part of managing many of the lands that we have as far as just maintaining the habitat. But when you start looking at fire for helping to control invasive plants, it's very much a case-by-case basis on the species you're trying to control and the status of that population. And a good example is Melaleuca. You don't want to try to use fire, a prescribed fire, to control Melaleuca if you have a lot of mature seeding trees. The plant is adapted to release a lot of seeds after a fire. And so you don't want to do it then. But if, as you saw in the presentation, if you've managed to reduce and remove most of the seed-bearing trees, and you have a lot of recolonizing saplings, smaller trees, fire can be a wonderful way to help suppress the plant. And as I discussed, help enhance the effect of biocontrol. So, fire can, in the case of Melaleuca, can be used under certain conditions. In the case of old world climbing fern that we talked about, this blanketing fern, pretty much there are very few cases where fire is really beneficial in the use for that. It seems to just make this plant more aggressive. So again, it depends on the species. As far as the air quality concerns, that's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. I'm not a prescribed fire guy, but I can tell you that when the district does plan to do a burn, we coordinate closely with the Department of Forestry, FWC, and others to pull a permit, and those considerations on air quality impacts are weighed when they make the decision to allow us to do a prescribed burn.
Thanks, Leroy. Ryan Ortega, got a question? Unmute yourself, Ryan.
It was not allowing me to, excuse me, Ryan Ortega. Thanks, Drew. Two things I wanted to say and then ask. The Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation manages thousands of acres. And so while it's not the same scale as you, of course, we do try to, at all costs, balance mechanical and chemical and use chemicals sparingly. And I think part of our reasoning is obviously in environmental health. But I think really what point we're missing and probably why we're even speaking about this today, and this is based on the news reporting and interactions I've had with folks, is that this is really about concern over public health as well as environmental health. And I think we need to address that, because part of this concern publicly really is just these visuals of you spraying large swaths of land and what that means for people's health, whether it's scientifically or just the perception thereof. And I think too, I would like to hear you speak, because this is something we grapple with, and I think is an important component of this that we need to make sure we're paying attention to, is the safety of employees who are handling these chemicals, and because again, this is about the perception of health and the reality of health for the public, and I would wager that's why we are speaking about this today.
Thank you for that comment. And the district, and Francois is going to talk a little bit more about this in his presentation, but the district, part of our approach and our policy is to use herbicides judiciously in every case, and we only utilize the herbicides that are approved by the EPA for use in sensitive environments. And so we rely on the direction from these agencies and academia on the potential dangers and whatnot of herbicides. And with that, we did try, obviously all of the precautions that are required by law on the label of these herbicides are followed, both for the applicator and anybody in the public. And so based on the direction that we're getting from these agencies when we're using these herbicides in accordance with the label, and using it as judiciously as possible, any kind of health impacts are greatly minimized.
And Ryan, I know that you guys struggle with the same concept, because I'm sure you follow the same guidelines. And so you're hitting the nail on the head. It's an intersection between sort of what we know scientifically and and then public perception on the issue. And so us and you being sort of public facing organizations certainly have to very much account for the public engagement on the issue. And that's, you know, and because there's such a public concern is why we had the strategy going forward to try to figure out how to reduce the use and dependency, but still maintain the exotics. So, you know, your point's very well taken.
Okay, I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
What it does remind me of, and I think we all need to be cognizant of this, whether or not, again, this is as much as it's somewhere between perception and fact. This does tap into culturally a similar feeling that something like, it really is Rachel Carson, right? This feels like Silent Spring, and I think that's what the public is remembering, and the public is engaging and channeling. And I think there are some genuine, valid concerns for environmental health that folks are bringing forward. But I think, you know, this is somewhere between public and environmental health. But that's
agreed. All right, next WRAC member is Doug Gaston.
Okay, I think I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
You bet.
Great. Good morning, Drew and staff, and thanks for a great presentation. Very informative. And I want to go back to the issue of coordination. And I understand your comment about the agencies coordinating, but in certain circumstances, maybe one agency takes the lead in a particular area. And I think Ryan's comment that Sanibel Captiva is engaged in some plant management as well, it kind of brings me back to this idea of, are there, when you have this number of entities engaged in a similar activity, is there a set of standard practices, best practices, you know, sort of uniform understandings about how to treat different types of invasives or exotics, and under, you know, different types of circumstances? So, you know, when you look at a water conservation area versus a canal versus a lake marsh area, right? Is there an understanding about best practices and standards, and are they shared, and do you try to you know, incorporate those into everyday practice?
Yes, that's a great question. This is Leroy again, and the answer is that the practices, the best management practices, if you will, for invasive plant management are very much communicated among various parties engaged in these activities throughout the state. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of informal but also formal groups that share information and discuss strategies. The Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, which has been around since the 90s, has been a clearinghouse of this kind of information sharing and has resulted in statewide management plans for many of these invasive species. Previously, there's no longer, but there was at one point. I should also mention, in addition to the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, there's the Florida Aquatic Plant Management Society, which is both agencies and industry that regularly share a great deal of information on the kind of enhancements that we've been putting in. And then, of course, all of our applicators get regular training through various programs, such as the University of Florida's pesticide applicator short course. So there are a lot of different ways that we're sharing information and getting to sort of a common approach to these things. And you know, it's sometimes, like I said, not a formal organization. There's no direct mandate for one agency to take a lead always, but I've found that there has been a great deal of coordination across the board to kind of streamline and improve our methods. because at the end of the day, we're all trying to find ways to do this work more efficiently and with the minimum environmental impact. And so when one group finds a way to do things better, we're anxious to share it with our other partners on the other side of the fence line.
This is Francois. I also would like to add, in certain instances, when we have certain species that we're looking into, for example, when we started controlling Melaleuca back in the 90s, all the agencies got together and developed a plan specific to Melaleuca. And this plan looked at, the problem with Melaleuca, how to control it, what kind of technologies was available to control it, who was using what, and we met quarterly to look at the different research, whether it was the universities doing it, the district, or anyone else, to kind of coordinate our efforts so we can develop an approach to control Melaleuca that everybody could share and use.
Thanks, guys. The next member we have is Inger Hansen.
This is Inger. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good. I work for DEP, and DEP, we do get into vegetation management through our park service and also aquatic preserves, but we also have a regulatory program that oversees discharges of any chemicals into the waters of the state. And when entities like Fish and Wildlife or the Water Management District applies aquatic herbicides to a water body, and they actually have to hold the NPDES permit from the state. It's a generic permit, and it has like a lot of requirements. Part of the requirements is that you minimize pesticide discharges, you develop a pesticide discharge management plan. It's very much about integrated pest maintenance, like prevention, look at other things. And it sounds like you're doing what you're supposed to do under our regulatory program, but I just wanted to let you know that we do actually oversee the discharges into the state water.
Thank you, Inger. And all right, one question I had, Leroy, is what is the in the chart where we show acres covered? What is underlying that data? What is acres covered?
Yeah, so acres covered is referring, so when we record information about our vegetation management activities, there are two acreage figures that we include. The first one is the area of extent that we send, and let's just say for an example, if it's a ground crew that's hand pulling Melaleuca seedlings, the area that they searched to actually remove those plants. The other acreage figure that we include is the acreage of treated, that we've actually treated. So if it was an herbicide application, they may cover 30 acres of land looking for scattered Melaleuca, but only apply herbicide to a half of an acre over that 30-acre parcel. So acres treated is where herbicide was applied. Acres covered is where we looked.
Okay, thank you. Gary, I see you have something else.
Yes, I apologize. I'll try to make this quick. Gary Ritter with the Florida Farm Bureau Federation. One of the things, Leroy, that you had talked about, and I looked over Francois, and I'm not sure maybe he might get into this, is water quality, and I think it's a good thing that we have been moving more toward mechanical harvesting and less, as your graph shows, use of chemical sprays. And I'm just wondering, is there any science, like say in the canals or even Lake Okeechobee, that tells us when we use chemical sprays and we have that biomass and sediment sink to the bottom, how, what impact does it have on internal loading of the system in terms of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, when we do that spraying and the biomass sinks to the bottom? And then secondly, I know if you look at some of the early reports on the Central and Southern Florida flood control system when they first built the levees, and when they built the levee around Lake Okeechobee, there was a program to establish some grass banks for the levee on the lake and canal levees. Is there any fertilizer activity that takes place on these levees anymore, or has that practice been stopped?
Okay, thank you for those questions. So on the first question regarding the impact of spraying and having large quantities of biomass going into a water body, say Lake Okeechobee, yeah, there is science that can give us answers to questions such as, what quantity of nitrogen phosphorus is now returned to the system. And as I was mentioning earlier in the presentation, floating aquatic vegetation in particular has what we call high turnover rates. So the plants grow and then relatively quickly will die, and then that decaying matter will float to or sink to the bottom of the lake. And most of these aquatic plants have a rapid decomposition rate, which means that the nutrients are quickly returned right back into the water column or remain in this fine sediment that I mentioned before. And so there is quite a bit of internal loading associated with floating aquatic plants. But the main point that I want to make here is that is especially true when floating aquatic plants are allowed to proliferate. And so one of the reasons that we are trying so hard to achieve maintenance control with floating aquatic vegetation is that while it may mean when you're doing active control, you have a large presence out there doing control on a regular basis, the overall loading of decaying matter and returning of nutrients is relatively low because the populations of that floating aquatic vegetation is very minimal. The problem that really arises, these big impacts to aquatic systems in particular, happen when you allow the aquatic vegetation to get out of hand and become so abundant that when you do whatever control you're going to do, it results in a sudden massive flux of nutrients and sediment to the system. So again, this is one of the reasons that agencies try so hard to maintain these harmful plants at lowest levels. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question.
I think it
does, yes.
That cover, okay, great. And the question you had asked about whether or not there is still a practice of fertilizer application to the levees, and my understanding is that we no longer do any fertilizer application on any of those grasses or anything like that along the Lake Okeechobee levee.
Yep. All right, James Evans.
Thanks, Drew. Can you hear me okay?
You bet.
Excellent, thank you. Leroy, great presentation, and we certainly fully support integrated pest management, and the district has a really good program. Appreciate all the work you do. Building on Gary's comments, I just had a question about the kind of cost-benefit analysis and whether or not a cost-benefit analysis has been done to assess the effects or benefits of mechanical removal versus, herbicide treatment that takes into account the nutrient removal benefits to the aquatic systems versus the impact of allowing that biomass to decompose and release those nutrients back into the water. Obviously, there's a huge cost to removing nutrients once they're in the water body, preventing them from getting there in the first place, or removing the material that they're bound in, on the biomass that they're bound in, obviously provides some significant benefits. And I was just wondering, in your integrated pest management plan, have you done any cost benefit to look at the benefits to water quality and the costs associated with either of those practices?
Great question, and we have certainly done at smaller scales some cost benefits to doing mechanical versus chemical or other means of control. For big projects like Lake Okeechobee, we're still working on that. We've actually started an initiative recently working with our research group to start looking at the feasibility of large-scale mechanical removal as a component of maintenance control. Again, a lot of the mechanical removal that the district does in our canal systems tends to be responses to massive outbreaks of invasives when typically they get dumped into our canal system from upstream sources. Or as you saw on the other slide, when we have submerged aquatics that just explode in our canals. And there it's more an action out of necessity, you know, that we can go in and do this mechanical removal quickly and open up the waterway and not, you know, wait for herbicides or other methods to do their work. And again, we can quickly remove that biomass. I think for maybe natural aquatic systems, we haven't really done a full cost benefit analysis that really accounts for the water quality impacts, some of the constraints that we have with regard to damage to non-native vegetation, some of the water quality impacts that may occur from each of the different practices. So I guess the summary answer is that we're actually working on getting to those answers for large natural aquatic systems.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. All right, now we're going to move to the second phase of the WRAC meeting, and I will turn it over to Francois to go ahead and look at how we're looking at enhancing our practices and let you guys know it, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you.
Yes, this is Francois LaRoche. I'm the Vegetation Management Section Administrator. And thank you, Drew, for the opportunity to discuss our program here at the district on vegetation management. I'd like to also thank Leroy for his presentation, and also mention that Leroy discussed an overall strategy of the district vegetation management program. I will be talking about the strategy that we are utilizing to further enhance the program and the hope of reducing the use of herbicide. So the purpose of this exercise was to address public concerns of herbicide use while we're still achieving the goals and mandates of the district vegetation management program. And our goals were to continue on the progress that we've made toward maintenance control, to enhance the program oversight, and also maximizing integrated pest management approach. And with that, we are aiming for about a 20% reduction over the next 5 years, or a continued reduction of herbicide use of about 20% over the next 5 years. Oh, it's not. Oh, we're having a little technical difficulty here. All right. Okay. Very good. So at first, I'd like to go over how the district manages the different areas of vegetation within our areas of responsibility. We have 3 different areas. The first one is the canal levee and aquatic systems. We mostly manage these areas for flood control and water movement purposes. This is the area we will focus on for the first phase, what we call phase 1 of our herbicide reduction strategy. We also have the STAs and FEBs, and we do manage invasive species throughout our natural conservation land, and these land also include project land that we eventually turn into STAs or FEBs. Throughout these areas, we manage over 76 priority invasive plants. And in addition to that, we also deal with some nuisance vegetation along canals and also in our natural areas. So the strategy that we will be discussing is mostly on phase 1 of the strategy, which is the canal levee and aquatic system. That's where we looked at and how we can further reduce the use of herbicide. Okay, at first I'd like to give you a little overview on herbicides. Those are compounds that are used to interfere with specific metabolic functions of plants, and they're unique to those functions that exist in plants. And these are photosynthesis, amino acid synthesis, and plant growth hormone productions. And these functions do not exist in humans and animals. There are two different categories of herbicide. Those are systemic, and those are killed by contact. Systemics means that the herbicide is absorbed through the roots or the leaves and then kill the plant. And the contact herbicides are usually once it touches the leaves, it will kill the plant. So you need good coverage to make sure that you cover the whole plant to be able to kill that plant. And the way we use them, we can use them selectively. We have selective herbicide and non-selective herbicide. Selective meaning that we can either direct the application to only kill the plant that we want to plant, or certain herbicide are effective in certain plants but are not effective in other plants. So you can go in and treat an area as it is in the pictures to the right. In the top picture, you can see the floating plants interfering with the growth of thalia and the STAs. So we were able to go in and control those plants and clear the floating and allow the thalia to continue to grow. Or you can use them as non-selective, where you direct them to kill all the vegetation that they touch. We use only approved herbicide that can be used in sensitive environment. And these herbicides usually have low toxicity and a short half-life, which means they don't reside in the environment for long. And also the district does not use any restricted use herbicide. Restricted use herbicide usually requires a permit for you to purchase it, and the district doesn't use any of those. All our herbicide use are used according to the label, as we are trained to understand that the label is the law. The label tells you how and where you can apply the herbicide, how you can mix it and dilute the herbicide to apply it, and also provide other information such as PPE use, personal protective equipment, and how you can apply it either by aerial, ground, or handheld application method. As one of the commentators mentioned, we are one of the operators that is required to get an NOI for the Federal Clean Water Act permit, and we abide by this permit, and this permit requires us to minimize herbicide as much as possible, and also requires us to collect data that we have to report into DEP every year on the amount and the location of where we use herbicide. We also require all person using herbicide, whether contractors or staff at the district, must be a licensed applicator, even though the herbicide that we are using does not require to be licensed to use them. However, the training that you go through to understand how to use herbicide is very important to the district. So therefore, we requires all our contractors to get a license, and our staff. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the approach that we took to look into how we can reduce herbicide. So we put a team together to kind of evaluate different alternatives that we can use in place of herbicide. And we thought that we can continue to learn from our success by using maintenance control as our ultimate goal, and integrated pest management approach, and continue to do adaptive management. So as we learn new ways and new methods, we continue to implement them. Again, as I mentioned, phase 1 would focus on the canal, levee, and aquatic program. We would look at different ways on how we can use different methods or change our practices to reduce herbicide. And whatever we learn in this first phase, we will then apply to phase 2. Phase 2 would be looking at natural areas and STAs. So we came up with different activities and recommendations, and we categorized them in 3 different actions. First actions were immediate actions that we could implement with our existing budget and maybe redirect some staff. Second ones were the actions, immediate actions that we could do, but that would require additional resources. And long-term actions would be the continued evaluations of new technology and continued coordination with industry and academia. So at first, let's talk about these immediate action that we could do without any additional budget. The first thing we looked at is to look at all the herbicide that we used and at what rate we were using them. As you know, most contractors, when they come in, they want to make sure the job is done. So most of the time, they're looking at a herbicide label and looking into what's the highest rate am I permitted to use that herbicide to get the job done. So if you use a high rate, then you are sure to make sure you killed everything that you are trying to treat. So we are currently looking into that and trying to figure out which herbicide that we can reduce some of the rates. For example, if a herbicide requires 2 quarts per acre to get control, the 2 quarts will be the maximum rate. Can we get the same control with using 1 quart? So those are the type of things we're looking at. And however, this would require oversight because we have to make sure that the contractors are doing what they're supposed to do and also get effective control. Another thing we looked at is also looking at the different herbicides that are out there to determine if certain herbicide can be as effective while using less active ingredient. For example, in the picture on the right, you have a person doing what we call a basal application. And if you look at the graph on the left, the basal application, the first 2 bars on the graph represent 2 different herbicides that we looked at. The light green is a herbicide called Garlon that we use. It takes about 8.4 pound of active ingredients to control an acre compared to another herbicide called Tricera, which uses only 4.5 pounds per acre of active ingredient. To the right of that graph, we have 2 other herbicides that we're looking into. They're newer herbicides. Those herbicides require a lot less active ingredient, as in the pictures on the middle shows a spray bottle just applying a very small amount of herbicide to a Brazilian pepper tree. And those herbicides requires only about 0.29 pound AI to control an acre of pepper. So those are the things we're looking at as far as reducing our herbicide rates and herbicide active ingredient. Second thing we're doing is evaluating new innovations. We are currently looking at what we call a WIC applicator. Is the pictures on the right. The 3 pictures on the right shows 2 different machines that we are currently evaluating. Those are mostly can be used on our levees where we have the tall grasses such as the pure grass Phragmites and that interfere with our levee system. We can then use those machines to apply the herbicide directly into the plant. The bar in these machines has a artificial carpet that is sprayed with the herbicide, and when you move the machine through, the herbicide touches the plant directly, so you're not broadcasting the herbicide on the levee. And the picture below shows the result where we were able to go through and kill the taller grasses without endangering the shorter grasses that we want on those levees. Second thing we're looking at is looking at adjuvants, different adjuvants. As the picture on the left, we're looking at this product called Nano Pro, which claims that you can reduce the amount of herbicide you use by about 60%. So one of our practices is anytime somebody brings us new product, we want to test it to make sure that it works. So we currently have several studies looking at various adjuvants that we can use to reduce the use of herbicide. Other things we're looking at is aquatic plant harvesting using various mechanical machines. Over the past couple of years, we've been cooperating with FWC and the Corps of Engineers and looking at different machines that we could use for the purpose of removing aquatic vegetation. The first picture on the left is a small project that we, the Corps of Engineers did in Lake Okeechobee as a demonstration using what we call the WeDo. It's a small machine that can go in and harvest the floating plants. And the advantage of this machine is that it can go in and selectively remove some of those floating plant without endangering the native species that we want to keep. For example, the bulrush in the middle of that picture was kept intact while the machine went around and removed the floating aquatic plants. However, taking those biomass off the lake, this project was done about 4 miles away from shores. So they use those small barges to transport the material to shores. And that was somewhat expensive to be able to carry all that material, and takes a long time since there were small barges and small machines. The picture on the right shows a canal, the LD4, which is the exterior rim of Lake Okeechobee Canal, where we use the same machines to clean about 3 acres of floating plants that was in the canal. This, I think, those machines were more appropriate for this job, as it was closer to shore. They were able to remove all the vegetation, and it was a lot less expensive to do so. And that is a project that we did in cooperation with FWC. Other aquatic plant harvesting project we've looked into, picture on the left are the using the larger mechanical harvesters. This machine is called a Kelpin machine. It's about 50 foot long, and it's a very large machine that can harvest a lot of material. We harvested about 60 acres of floating plant, and the cost of that was the least expensive cost that we achieved per acre. It was about $800 per acre for removing the floating plants with these machines in this situation. Compared to the weedoos that we used in the lake, they range from close to almost $100,000 per acre to about $8,000 in that canal per acre. Pictures on the right, this is another project we did on Lake Okeechobee using kind of medium-sized machines, and also with new innovation in the machine. And the picture on the top where you have an arm on the harvester that can go and move side to side to remove vegetation. As you know, one of the problems with these machines, they're very cumbersome and hard to navigate to remove all the vegetation. So that proved to be very helpful. And we used the machines in 3 different locations in the lake. And again, due to the proximity to the disposal area, the cost varied from about $3,000 to about $6,000 per acre. Other thing we're looking at as far as harvesting technologies, we are currently looking into bringing a machine for a demonstration project. It's called a MERV, a multi-purpose emergency response vehicle. This machine is very unique. It has a basket in the middle of it that can be filled with the vegetation as it is harvesting it. And those baskets can then be dropped in the water and then tied together and carried later to shores. So that will reduce the amount of transport you have to do back and forth to take the vegetation to shore. Another advantage to this machine is it can be kind of folded, as you see in the picture on the right, and easily transported from site to site, compared to the bigger harvesters where you need crane and different equipment to take them in and out of the water. Another thing we're looking at with University of Florida is the use of GPS technologies to better improve the way these harvesters work. For example, when you're doing submerged treatment, it's difficult for the operator to see where the vegetation is. So you end up going twice or 3 times over the same area. As if you do have a GPS tracking system on board, the operator can know exactly where he's been. So every time he comes back, he can do it to a new thwart and not be going over the same path. Okay, other thing we're looking into as far as things we can do immediately without increasing our budget, it's the use of grass carps. Leroy mentioned that in his presentation, and what we're doing there is continue to look at different canals that are appropriate for stocking with grass carp. The problem with grass carp is we have to make sure that they don't move from the areas that you stock them. So we have to install barriers and do different things to make sure that once we stock this canal, they would stay in place. We also anticipate talking to neighboring 298 districts. For example, in Miami-Dade County, they do have canals that dump into our canal system. If we can encourage them to put grass carp in their canal, that would again help so we don't have infestation coming from their canals into our canals. Other things we looked at is the use of in-house harvesters or long reach to remove vegetation from our structures in areas where we use the spray. So rather than spray, we would bring a machine to kind of harvest the vegetation. Other things we can do, we also have trash rake system at the pump station that we can allow the vegetation to go through the trash rake and remove the vegetation with the trash rake rather than spray it. We also engage with our legal office to determine how we can engage the local drainage district and also farmers which are discharging into our canal to encourage them to treat their infestation in their side of on their land before they dump into our canal, and also looking at ways we can encourage them to do so. We also are looking into improving equipment decontamination, making sure all our contracts include language to get contractors to understand that they have to decontaminate every time they're coming into our land, or if they're moving from one area of the district to go to another area, they have to make sure we decontaminate the equipment. And for that, again, oversight is going to be important to make sure district staff is looking at these contractors and getting them to decontaminate their equipment before they move. And other things we can do also is to continue to work with the USDA to develop new biological control for aquatic weeds. We can encourage them to do so, and also we can provide funding for them to look into other insects to control aquatic weeds. So now let's talk about things that we can do but would require us to get additional funding and also staffing to implement. One of the things we have been doing in our canal is the use of weed barriers to collect the weeds as they're floating down the canal. And we do have a lot of these already installed in our canal. As you can see in the map on the right, all the little green dot, the purple and yellow dots are areas where we currently have buoys to collect weeds. The red dots, the bigger red dots, are areas we have identified that we can put additional barriers to collect weeds. And in these areas, rather than use herbicide to come and treat those plants, we are looking more and more into using mechanical harvesting machine, towboats, and long reach to remove that vegetation. Another area we looked at is on our levees. As far as mowing, we want to increase the mowing frequency to reduce herbicide use. Also using string mowing, going around in areas where it's difficult to use a machine like tractors to, as a picture on the left, rather than use herbicide, we would bring people with weed eaters to control those weeds. Also increase our flat mowing and also slope mowing activities. If we were doing 4 cycles per year, then try to increase to 6 to 8 cycles to suppress the invasive grasses such as Napier grass. If you mow more, you may suppress them and having to use less herbicide. Other thing we're looking at is aerial applications, and areas of our levees, as the picture on the left indicates, we used to use helicopters to broadcast herbicide on our levees, as you can see in the pictures in the middle. as we are getting control of those levees, we then stop the use of helicopters and use trucks with a handgun to go out and look for those tall grasses or broadleafs that are interfering with our levees and control them that way. And the picture on the right is a new tools that we started testing this year, is the use of a cable with a tank and a herbicide tank under the helicopter that you can go directly to a tree such as Melaleuca and the conservation areas when we don't have those large stand of Melaleuca anymore, and you can use that helicopter to go and spray just one plant rather than be doing a broadcast application. Another thing we need to do is to improve our program oversight by using different technologies and also training our staff and contractors. One of the technologies we're looking at is the use of GPS to install units in our in the applicators' airboats or trucks. We are working with FWC on this project. We're looking into also putting a switch into the spray system, as the picture on the bottom right indicates, where every time the applicator will depress the handgun, it will show you on a map. As on top we see the pink areas, the track is the blue areas where the boat has been, but every time the applicator depress the spray to spray herbicide, it will show you exactly where and how the herbicide was sprayed. So this will hopefully encourage applicators to be more diligent. So because now we know exactly where they are applying the herbicide, and also by knowing the time that trigger was depressed, we can also try to calculate the amount of herbicide that is used. So not only the applicator has to let us know how much is using at the end of the day, but we can also, if we know how he calibrated his sprayer, how much he's going to be delivering, we can calculate how much was used and where it was used. The picture on the left shows our district staff doing training with applicators and contractors, and we're going to need to do more of that as we're implementing those different strategies. We need to also train our applicators, train our staff to understand how they need to monitor the activities out that we are doing and implementing. Long-term actions is to continue to evaluate different technologies. As Leroy mentioned, and one of the questions was about the use of mechanical harvesting to remove invasive species as a mean of nutrient removal. We're looking into this. We're working with our research staff, and they're looking into this, and hopefully we'll figure out if it is possible and cost effective to remove aquatic plants for nutrient removal. We also are looking into livestock feed, if we can harvest plants and use them as livestock feed. We're looking into that with IFAS, and we will continue to look at that to see if that's feasible in our program. And also to continue work with USDAs if we need to provide funding for them to continue to do research and looking into new biocontrol for aquatic weeds. And then we'll continue to coordinate with industry and academia to continue evaluation of herbicide. Herbicide have been used for a long time, and if you look at the history of herbicide use over the year, herbicides are being more effective. We're using less active ingredients, and also trying to use herbicides that are better for the environment. So we'll continue to look at these possibilities with researchers to make sure that we're using the proper products without causing any problems to the environment. Application technologies, as the backpack on the picture on the right, the one on the backpack is what we call a smart one, where it will determine exactly where and how much herbicide was used. we're looking into implementing these different technologies to make sure that the amount of herbicide we use, we know exactly where to use and how much that we use. Also looking at novel harvesting approaches, precision harvesting using GPS technology, GPS guided machines to help better harvest the biomass that's out there and make it more efficient. Also, there are folks looking at other ways, for example, in the picture on the right, bottom picture on the right, using boom, and also looking at wind motion on a lake system to understand where the plants are going to be so they can set up boom to trap and corral the plants and then harvest them, which then make it less expensive to do. So we'll continue to work with academia and the industry to look at new ways and new alternatives for controlling vegetation without herbicide. So what are the anticipated outcomes for this exercise? So the first thing we hope is by year 2021 to do a further reduction of our herbicide use by at least 7%. Based on the calculation we've made on all these things that we're trying to implement, the table on the right shows you for the different action we will take, the amount of herbicide we anticipate reducing as far as how much active ingredient. For the herbicide rate reductions, expand IPM and oversight, increase mowing and reduce aerial application, and also using weed barriers for a total of about 10,000 pounds of active ingredient. We also think we can achieve further reduction of 20% within the next 5 years. So in that graph I showed, you can continue to decrease that amount by 20% in 5 years. So we will complete the current evaluation of the technologies and herbicide alternatives that we're looking at. And also we will focus on improved contractor oversight and also our staff, keeping the training and keeping them proficient at what they do to make sure that they implement these strategies that we came up with. And then in phase 2, we would look at what we've learned from this first exercise and see how we can apply it within the STAs and also in our natural area program. So again, I will show you the graph that Leroy closed with to show you over the past 10 years how much herbicide we reduced. So we're hoping by 2024, we can further reduce the use of our herbicide by about 20%. And the graph on the right showed you the amount of herbicide that was used by the district. And we can show a reduction of about 60% of the total herbicide that was used from 2010 to now. And we hope to continue to reduce the amount that we use by implementing those strategies. So in summary, reduce herbicide use and our costs through an integrated management approach, and also continue to do adaptive management, looking at new ways and implementing those new ways to achieve those results. And our next step is to continue to seek public input and evaluate new approaches. I'm sure there are things that we are not currently looking at that maybe in 4 or 5 years, somebody else will have a new idea. So we need to be out there to continue to work with the universities and industry or in the public to listen and understand what is out there, what other technologies that we can use. And those that we found that are feasible, we can implement them. And also we'll continue to coordinate with other agencies, the industries and researchers to continue to improve our program. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. That was a lot of information to take in. A lot of effort went into it, and I really appreciate your and Leroy's and all your staff's work to develop all these ideas. And so what we want to do is turn to a RAC member discussion. And if you're a RAC member, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. And this is where we can ask, you can ask questions, or you can make general comments, whatever you want to do. And so I'll look to the attendees, see who's the RAC member, and call on you. And then after we have that RAC discussion, we'll move on to public comment. go from there. So let's see, the first WRAC member with their hand up is Jeff Mullins.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Great presentations. Thank you very much for this good information today. A couple of questions. One, you may have already shown this earlier. Out of the total IPM pie, what is the percentage of the herbicide approach out of your control tools? And then my second question is there a good understanding currently of the use of herbicide and its effect on periphyton, or does more research need to be done there? Thank you.
Okay, the first question about the percent of herbicide in our IPM, I don't have an exact number, but we do probably use herbicide more than any of the other methods in our IPM practices. We do, however, try to look at every opportunities we have to kind of use other methods than herbicide. And as we get closer to maintenance control, we then go, for example, in our Melaleuca program, we use a lot more hand pulling when the seedlings are coming, rather than wait until the trees are big where we can't hand pull them. So we do implement other methods as we see fit and where it is feasible. The second question, as far as herbicide use on periphyton, is that the question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. We are looking into that. We're currently doing some studies with glyphosate. As you know, glyphosate is a phosphorus-based herbicide. So we are currently looking at the impact of when we are using glyphosate, if does that impact the periphyton growth in the water column. So those are things that we're looking at. We don't have any results yet, but we are mindful of that and we're looking into it.
All right. All right, next we have James Evans.
Thanks, Drew. Great presentation, Francois. I don't actually have any comments related to your presentation. I think the district's doing a great job. Certainly, I'd want to recommend that you continue to look at that cost benefit as it relates to the water quality benefits by removing the biomass versus the treatment and allowing those that biomass to go back in the waterways. But I wanted to shift gears a little bit and make some general comments and a statement. Obviously, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's meeting. It's been a really good discussion. But the city of Sanibel would like to go on record supporting a science-based process for the development of LOSUM. We're very concerned that there have been efforts to incorporate language in WRDA 2020 that would apply the savings clause to LOSUM. And we feel that if the savings clause is applied to the lake regulation schedule, it would favor the water supply over the ecology of Lake Okeechobee and the northern estuaries. And that would certainly make it very difficult to meet the recovery performance measures established for the lake and estuaries. And we really feel that the LOSUM process needs to balance all of the project purposes equally. And we hope that the district will continue to support the Corps' position that the savings clause does not apply to non-CERT projects. And perhaps this is an issue that the WRAC may want to consider having a workshop to discuss further, because I know there are a lot of issues, and I think that we all could be educated on all of the different components of the savings clause and as it relates to the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Of course, we're talking about exotics control. I certainly understand your opinion. And we are, as a district, had a discussion about LOSUM at the last board meeting. And we are going to continue to work with the Corps to develop out the metrics on the benefits of LOSUM and do the modeling and help the Corps with the modeling. And there might be a time in the future where we bring that to, it might be the board, it might be WRAC, but just what we're seeing is the opportunities with LOSUM with improving all the endpoints. So Anyway, back to exotics control. Richard, you're next in line. Richard Pinsky.
Thank you, Drew, and I do have a comment about the process. Thank you to Francois, to Leroy, also taking the time in advance of the meeting to chat with me. They're very helpful. And I am not even close to pretending. I don't even play one on TV, an expert on whether the balance of the amount of chemicals, the herbicides, you know, the process we're using. But I do believe the district is doing exactly what it should be doing. And I was very impressed with everything I've heard and everything I heard today. I have no way of evaluating whether it's spot on. I'm assuming it is, and that's why my comments to follow are gonna be based on the assumption that we are doing it all right. So I don't know how often we set the policy. It seems like the science is always changing, so maybe this is just an ongoing change. But it would seem to me, from some of the comments I heard earlier, and then through the presentation, that there are other entities within the ecosystem that the Water Management District covers that we may coordinate with, we may be aware of, but we're really not in charge of, for lack of a better term. So I think we mentioned earlier Fish and Wildlife. We mentioned earlier the Lake Worth Drainage District in Dade County. 298 districts. There are a number of things going on that impact our canals at the Water Management District supervisors and whatever water bodies we impact. So my first comment is, who is setting not the policy for the Water Management District, but who is setting the policy for the entire ecosystem that we're just not coordinating, and we're just not being made aware of, but someone is actually, in the same way I think we had a staff person from DEP say they are watching all the nutrients, everything that goes into the water. Well, who is watching and balancing all the various vegetation eradication and control methods from all the entities within the ecosystem that the Water Management District is in charge of? I would suggest that if there's legislation that's needed or policy by the governors needed, but I would be suggesting that the Water Management District should be an entity that is in charge of all eradication and control of vegetation by whoever is doing it in their respective jurisdiction. So, you know, what is that policy? I'm assuming we would be the Water Management District would be the entity to develop that policy and set that policy district-wide. So I know that every session up in Tallahassee, there's always a policy discussion on permitting, who's in charge, nutrient levels, and in this case, everything that's impacting the lake, both at the north end, what's going out, discharges. I know that we don't want to remove large volumes of vegetation that increases sunlight, you know, promotes blue-green algae, but the policy I'm trusting is science-based. The district knows what it's doing. Now my concern is the entities that are just catch can that we're not in charge of within the ecosystem that are impacting what we're doing. And that's my comment.
Thank you, Richard. That's a big thought. And I know that we have a role when it comes to sort of canals and folks that move canal water into our canals. And so there might be something there, but when it comes to private land versus public land and that kind of thing, I don't know, Francois, whether there's any kind of insight you can give on sort of what the governance is.
Well, there is not one agency that kind of oversee all veg management at this point. I mean, each agency kind of manage the area that they have jurisdiction over. For example, district, we are responsible for our canals, our natural areas, and we pretty much set our policies and how we do that. However, we do have to do things according to the NPDES permit. So we developed a management plan, a pesticide discharge management plan, to make sure we abide by what the permit requires. And various agencies have to do the same thing. So that's one way that one agency guides that. Is DEP, I think, oversees the permit, so everybody has to follow what the permit requires. As far as the lead agency in the state for vegetation management is the FWC. They oversee all the vegetation management in state waters. And they have a program that we coordinate with. So for example, in Lake Okeechobee or the Kissimmee Chain of Lake, FWC is a lead agency, but we participate and help coordinate decision-making, how things are done. But they're the one who's actually doing the controlling and the management of the vegetation. We do also support them by allowing them to use our contractors. They do pay us to do veg management. So there is not one agency that oversees all vegetation management throughout the areas of the district. But that's something, if I guess, we'll need legislation to get one agency to do so. If it's the district, then definitely would need legislation to do that.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure it's a local government's role. I mean, if you're looking for statewide governance, and maybe that. So anyway, something we'll take down. Thank you, Richard. Next is Gary Ritter.
Yeah, Francois, great presentation. Leroy, great presentation. This has really been extremely informative for me. I've been very, very interested in the aquatic vegetation program for quite some time. And I do have a question on sticking with the spirit of this, but I do want to make one statement kind of in response to James. But you know, I feel largely there is a lack of understanding of the water savings clause and the history behind it. And perhaps maybe we should have some further discussions with various stakeholders on this topic, and I'll just leave it at that. My question is concerning the novel harvesting approach, Francois, that you talked about. And one of the things that I was sitting here thinking, you know, there have been many researchers in the past that have looked at the use of water hyacinth and water lettuce for water quality treatment purposes. And I see that, you know, you are using barriers and booms to kind of corral a lot of this vegetation to make it easier to harvest. And I'm wondering if there is an optimum time for harvest where you could actually get maximum water quality treatment using, you know, the corralled water hyacinth water lettuce before you actually take it out of the system, or if that's ever been looked at. Because especially in the canals at the north end of the lake, is there an approach that can be made to where you could get some appreciable water quality and nutrient removal above and beyond, you know, the biomass that you're taking out, you know, in these canal systems, flood control canal systems?
Well, not sure on that, but one of the issues, our flood control system, we have to move water. And if we allow plants to grow in those canals, then it'll be problematic for us to move water. So that's one thing we do not want in our canal, is to have vegetation growing and having these mats. So when they hit structures and pump station, we're definitely going to have issues. So as far as using those vegetation to remove nutrient, that is certainly possible, but the canal system is probably not where I would recommend we look into doing this.
Yeah, well, I was kind of more thinking of, and I understand, you know, it's flood control system, you want to keep these mats away from the structures. But I was kind of wondering if, you know, let's say mid-canal, away from the structure, if you couldn't corral some of these mats and get some water quality treatment as water is flowing through, you know, the root zones of the water hyacinth, get some nutrient uptake, and keep them away from the structures. Just a thought.
Yes, that's certainly possible. However, the risk of getting these mats to escape, as I know Leroy showed a picture, we had some vegetation from an adjacent system where some vegetation got out from their system into a canal and took out 2 bridges. So it doesn't take much for these floating mats to cause damage. And if we are growing them in our canal and we have a storm and a buoy breaks, we can definitely cause a lot of problems with those mats. So that would be my concern.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Ryan or Jara.
Yes, yes, I've unmuted myself. I just want to say, one, I think there's really some evidence here of great efforts to reduce chemical spraying. I think no matter how you cut it, that always had to be the answer given the public's response. And I think it's the right thing to do. And I think that the steps you're making and underlining for the public really is the way to go. The one thing though I do want, and I know it's been broached, but I think we do need to explore it more, and I don't mean necessarily today. But I think in this process, we really need to make some guarantees that any chemical process is not materially increasing the nitrogen and phosphorus loads in the water. I know we've talked about that, but I think we need to be quite sure that that process is not being, that those nutrients are not being exacerbated in any process we undertake, or at least minimally so. And finally, I just want to second what James Evans said, and that SCCF supports a sound science-based approach for LOSM, and that the ecology of the lake and the Caloosahatchee and our estuary is our lifeblood. And we urge the district to hold to the principle that the savings clause does not indeed apply to non-SERP projects. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ryan. Next RAC member I have is Lee Hefty.
Good morning. Great presentation. I just wanted to follow up on something that Richard said regarding collaboration, especially with local governments. I know within Miami-Dade County, we manage many tens of thousands of acres of preservation lands in the south end of the system. And we co-own land with the state. We own land adjacent to many of the water management district lands. And we have an MOU in place regarding invasive plant management. So I just want to point out that that kind of collaboration does occur. And I do think it's important where the district can forge those relationships to continue to do so we can co-manage this problem, because it's an ecosystem-wide problem. So thank you.
Thank you, Lee. I did get a note from RAC member Benita Whalen with the cattlemen, and she wanted to make sure that we all recognize low density cattle grazing as a effective tool for exotics management control. And I know that is one that we use at the Water Management District for a lot of our lands, is some low density cattle grazing. So thank you, Benita, for sending that to me. She's having technical difficulties. Any other RAC members? Dr. Arrington.
Can you guys hear me?
You bet.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for hosting this meeting and this important discussion. I thought the earlier comments regarding Rachel Carson were relevant. I know that A lot of the technical people around this subject believe that aquatic herbicide in particular is necessary. Whether it's an evil or not, they at least deem it necessary, but a large segment of the public is concerned significantly by this. So I appreciate the information that was presented. I especially like the idea of the GPS sprayer on and off button on the airboats. I think that's excellent. I really appreciate the district and district staff working with contractors to implement that technology. I would encourage the district to make that data publicly available as efficiently as possible. I don't know if real time is a realistic option. I don't expect you to respond with a comment on that. But if it were available real time or certainly as expedient as possible, that kind of information can help the public. I also think in this discussion, there are different perceptions of chemical being sprayed, what is appeared as ad nauseum on water bodies versus sprayed in what often appears very targeted terrestrial lands. And I would ask in any future presentations like this, and I recognize your staff are working trying to make these presentations efficient and streamlined and not take 3 days. But in future presentations of this topic, I think it would be helpful if you could segregate into terrestrial and aquatic components of the herbicide application. I think there are major emotional differences between those two classes. And I think that some of the data application rates and others may be confounded when we're looking at terrestrial applications versus aquatic. I commend the district on pursuing the more mechanical aspects. I recognize those are costly, but given the concern by the public and given that the work of the district is funded by the public, many times economists will conduct a willingness to pay survey. And I would imagine if a willingness to pay survey was conducted, that the public, at least a large segment of the public, would show a willingness to pay for mechanical work, even though it's more expensive than the chemical treatment. And one of the kind of obvious reasons that jumped out at me on that, when the mechanical harvesting was being discussed in the first presentation, the reference was to the biomass that would be accumulated on canal banks and that would have to be addressed. And that was listed, you know, the implication is clearly a negative. And I totally respect that. Practically, right, you wind up with giant piles of biomass that have to be addressed. What is invisible, but what is practically understood by many people who are concerned about aquatic herbicide application, is that that biomass doesn't miraculously disappear after aquatic herbicide application. It actually sinks to the bottom, creates significant biological oxygen demand, smothers fish beds, and does a number of environmental or ecological impacts that go unseen to the casual observer. And so when you're thinking about the negatives of mechanical harvesting, I think it should be considered as a significant positive in the removing of that biomass from the water column, from the water body, and then allow it to decompose in a terrestrial context, as opposed to killing it in situ in the water, allowing it to sink down and cause the impact. Again, I appreciate this topic, and I appreciate the presentations and the good, diligent work the district is doing in so many cases to try and work progressively on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aubrey. Appreciate those points. Next I have is Charles LaPrade. Are we able to unmute Charles?
Yeah, and I allowed them to talk, but don't see a
Gotcha.
microphone, so I'm wondering if he's calling in from a phone number as well.
If you're calling in from a phone, Charles, hit *6.
Actually, hit *9 to raise your hand if you're calling in from a phone, so I can see that it's you.
Well, Charles, if we aren't able to make this work, we'll reach out to you. Any other RAC members before we move to public comment? Okay, I am going to go ahead and move to public comment. Please raise your hand if you're interested in giving public comment. I know Diane Perry, you've been very patient, and I will go to you first. If you're calling in by phone, *9 raises your hand, and then *6 mutes and unmutes you. Ms. Perry, please, you're up first.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Whoever was just talking about the biomass, you are so spot on. You know, the harvester is so fantastic, and I don't know what machine should actually do this. And of course, the cost would be something that, you know, is considered, but it shouldn't be a deciding factor by any means. Because what you can do for the water quality to remove the biomass, which it has to have secondary purposes. I can't imagine livestock feed is the only thing. Have you looked at the nutrient value of that biomass?
Hi, this is Leroy. I can
Leroy?
field it. Yeah, sure. And thank you for that.
Yeah, during the public comment, we're not going to answer questions,
apologies.
but we are looking at that. And if you want to get on our website and hit Ask Us, then we can make sure we get back in touch with you to sort of have that dialogue with you.
Okay, so I can do that because that's huge. The next thing on the grass carp, it requires barriers so that these carp don't get into the ecosystem because they must not be good for the ecosystem. Is that what I'm hearing?
So that's a question. Obviously, we do it so that it is not harmful to the ecosystem because that's our mission. Number one is protecting the ecosystem. But I can have someone give you a call and go through all why we know that.
Okay, so the other thing about that is if you have to install a barrier, how much does that barrier cost? You would think it'd be pretty big.
Mm-hmm. Right, all in cost benefit.
But how much does the barrier cost? Like you had some cost up that we're talking about, you know, how much pesticides cost per acre. There was also the tools that you were using. And I know you tried a small weed-ewe with a small barge. And I think the cost on that was like $100,000 per acre. And that would discourage anybody looking at that number. But there were other ways of being able to do that. And actually, maybe $100,000 per acre is not a bad price if the nutrient reduction in the lake is significantly better, because the quality of Lake O is just so bad. And if we could just address that for all of the downward things, I think so much would go away and everything would be worth it. I see I'm running out of time, so let me go back over here. The public perception on the pesticide is exactly what the guy talked about with the dying of the plants and taking out the oxygen and killing the habitat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yvette, I'm going to turn it over to you to facilitate public comment.
Sure. The next one, I have a telephone number ending in 5091. Can you please unmute? followed by Ramon Iglesias.
This is Raymond Iglesias. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you for the presentations today. I'm actually a little bit disappointed because I was too ready to give you guys a presentation of what Dr. Arrington was talking about earlier, because he nailed it. You know, we're talking about spraying invasive plants, not only on Lake Mississippi, but all water bodies in Florida. And at the end of the day, the collateral damage is what's sitting on the bottom of these lakes. And what you have to understand is that you have nitrogen and phosphorus in that sediment, but I'm holding in my hand a mason jar full of water, and half the mason jar has sediment from the bottom of the lake. But as I invert that jar upside down, previously to that, that water was almost gin clear. But as I invert it, now that water that's in my hand is completely black, preventing the sunlight to penetrate the natural filtration grasses growing on the bottom of these lakes in Florida. That being said, now you have to assume that you have 20 and 30-mile-an-hour winds on these lakes. You have boat wakes and waves coming through, disturbing that sediment on the bottom, reintroducing those nutrients back into the water column. So Dr. Arrington, you nailed it, and I appreciate that. As far as the mechanical harvesting, Leroy, you mentioned in your presentation that you love mechanical harvesting, and I do too. That I believe that we have to figure out how we can fund mechanical harvesting. I don't think it's the only thing that needs to be done. I know that spraying won't go away completely, but I do believe it is part of a great solution to eliminating herbicides. Now, as far as mechanical equipment considered as shredding, I don't like the idea of shredding, because once again, instead of putting chemicals in the water, you're still shredding that plant life, and it's still creating a sediment on the bottom of the lake. The presentation in reference to the GPS technology, I met with Kip Froelich at FWC a few years back, gave him the idea as far as using a camera-based system as a GoPro to show the quality of work that the applicators are doing on these bodies of water, because many times they're actually holding down the trigger and not only hitting the invasive plants, but hitting the good plants that the lakes need for filtration and for habitat. That being said, they kind of run into some problems because it becomes public record, and they got to figure out how to bank that information with the camera system. So then they went to this GPS technology with the spraying, which is great to an extent, but you still don't know the quality of work they're doing. You only know the ratio of what that chemical and herbicide's doing, where they're tracking it. So thank you for your time.
You there, Yvette?
Next, we have Diana Umpira. Diana?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, Diana Umpira with Sierra Club. And one of the comments I have is, first, thank you for definitely hosting this. And I hope that you will also do this in person. You know, obviously with proper safety measures in place. It's important that this be equitable. Sorry, my mom is talking in the background. That this be equitable. And, you know, as you can see from what some other things that people have said, they want to be able to also show you the effects that they're having, whether it's bringing a jar or bringing the dead fish that they've been catching. They want to be able to do that. And so I just want to encourage you to continue this discussion in an actual in-person public meeting. You know, we're spending a lot of money on Everglades restoration efforts. And we have to remember that sometimes the less costly thing is prevention. And so I really want to encourage the district and WRAC members to really emphasize just how important it is to stop the herbicide chemical spraying. You know, there are people in Lake O and in the nearby canals that actually fish and they eat what they catch, and it's just, you know, it's a real concern for many of them. I know my own lake, you know, where I am. I know it's not the district that is doing it, but over the past, 20 years or so that I've been living here, we've been getting less and less of natural aquatic vegetation, less fish, less wading birds. And all I can see is definitely people spraying like crazy here. There's someone that said, you wouldn't want to put in the water for your child, poisons, right? And you won't want to put it into our waterways. And I think really the same thing can be said, whether we have kids or not. It's just common sense that if we won't put these poisons in where we bathe, why the hell are we putting them in our waterways? And I just want to emphasize just how important it is to make sure that we don't keep repeating the mistakes of the past. We have had a history where government agencies have said it is totally fine and safe to use asbestos, to have lead in water, to have DDT, nicotine, and I could go on about all the things that have been said to be safe. And we have found out that they have not been. And the cost to humans and wildlife is just enormous. So let's apply the precautionary principles and just end once and for all this chemical herbicide spraying. Thank you so much.
Next, we have Nyla Pipes.
Thank you very much. Nyla Pipes, One Florida Foundation. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Fantastic. I just wanted to say thank you very much for having this conversation. The public is incredibly concerned, and I think that a lot of really good points have already been made, so I won't take too much time. I want to echo pretty much everything that Dr. Aubrey Arrington had to say. What people see is they see all of that detritus going to the bottom of the lakes and the canals and every water body, pretty much statewide with this spraying conversation. And they're educated. They know that creates the muck. And they know that the muck resuspends and that the muck is causing a lot of our internal loading issues. And that in turn then feeds the algal blooms, right? And so people are really aware and they're looking at this and they're going, okay, we have to stop somewhere in this cycle. And I think that it's really important. Somebody said that we really get at what we're doing as far as treatment of the vegetation and what that is doing in turn as far as either being a negative or a positive when it comes down to our nitrogen, our phosphorus loading. I think we really have to look at that carefully, and we have to realize that we have a muck problem, that the way we're treating and dealing with our vegetation is more than likely contributing to that muck problem. And we have to make some changes. And I think that, anywhere we can, that it is the best solution. We have to look at the mechanical harvesting. So I'm really glad to hear what all you're looking at there, as well as some of the other controls. So thank you very much. And we'll just keep the conversation going. And again, I want to reiterate, having the Zoom option, even once we return to in public meetings, in face-to-face meetings, I think is a really great opportunity for the general public at large. Thanks.
Next, we have Michael McGrath.
Oh, hello. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Michael McGrath, and I'm with the Sierra Club. As a resident of Fort Myers and someone who lives on the Caloosahatchee, I'm very concerned about the spraying of herbicides and how it affects downstream water bodies the district has been managing out west. And I know I'm not alone. When I attend meetings that the FWC hosted back in February on Lake O Management Plan, there was widespread opposition to the spraying of herbicides from anglers and residents alike. This is clearly an issue that affects our fisheries, our outdoor recreation, and our local economy. And it's a public health issue also. We all know there's a huge amount of biomass that can be removed when you do mechanical harvesting. We know that when that biomass is removed from the lake, it presents some tremendous economic opportunities. It can be a source of new jobs, a new natural resource to produce compost, livestock feed, biochar, and a new revenue stream for local governments. It also will remove immense amount of nitrogen and phosphorus from the water. So I think we all know that mechanical harvesting is the way we should be going about for removing invasive vegetation, as will help improve our water quality, and no longer allow that dead muck to accumulate at the bottom of the lake, which we all know is one of the significant sources of water pollution. So whether it's the decline in our healthy fisheries, possible harmful health effects that spraying these herbicides have on human and wildlife, or the harmful algal blooms, continue to spray, we're going to create a public health crisis. I was very disappointed when I saw they're only aiming for, the division only aiming for 7% herbicide reduction in fiscal year 2021, and only 20% reduction in fiscal year 2026. This has been an ongoing problem with a lot of public concern, and we all know what the solution should be. Considering the widespread public demands to stop the spray, shouldn't we be setting our sights higher? Shouldn't we be focusing and prioritizing discontinuation of herbicides instead of harvest instead? Why hasn't there been a cost-benefit analysis done or investigated further? I think we should leave these questions and ponder on them and actually act upon them as well. Thank you.
Next, we have Michael Collins.
Yeah, we live there?
Yes.
All right. Thanks. You can sign me up as part of the crowd that's 100% behind Dr. Aubrey Arrington's analysis. I've been fishing and duck hunting in the lake for over 40 years. There is no question in my mind that something happened when the spraying campaign left the Army Corps and went over to Fish and Wildlife. There have been multiple public hearings held on it. I was involved in a couple of them. I really haven't seen anything happen outside the district. The district has been the leader on the spraying issue and invasive issues for a generation. You guys do a great job. But there's a real question in my mind how much the other agencies are really looking at the same stuff. I think there needs to be a larger coordination. I don't think there's any question that at the level of Leroy and Francois and the guys down in the trenches, it's all well coordinated. But the big policy issues aren't being coordinated. When we renewed the lease on the Loxahatchee Wildlife Refuge, Fish and Wildlife agreed to fund the effort to get rid of Lygodium at a certain level. I think they've met the annual numbers for that maybe once or twice in the last 20 years. You get down to Everglades National Park, 15 miles down the Wilderness Waterway from Chokoloskee, it's totally overrun with Brazilian pepper. If you go out on the upland portion of Cape Sable, the same deal. There's hundreds of acres of it, of impacts on native species. So I think what the district's doing great, but I don't think the district reducing 10% of the herbicide in Lake Okeechobee is really going to solve the problem. Fish and Wildlife's going to have to do something about whatever changed when it changed from the Corps. I think they started spraying a whole lot more of the lake than they did before. And I think we need to review all those policies for the big picture answers. Otherwise, great work by the district, but let's see if we can kick this up the food chain a little bit. Thanks, guys.
Next, we have Tiffany Graham.
Unmute. Hello. I would like to say, I was wondering, with all of the unemployment that's happening right now in our state, is there any way to put some of those people to work, maybe manually removing the invasives or aquatics or even the muck? We really need to put people to work. And thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Next, we have Mike Elfenbein.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Mike, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Unmute, Mike.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hello? Are you there?
Mike, we're here. We can hear you.
Oh, thank you, Yvette. I appreciate it. Sorry, I'll keep it short. Celebrating my daughter's graduation, but I waited a couple hours, so I'll give it a shot. One, I wanted to thank Jackie. A few weeks ago, some sportsmen brought to her attention that there was a algae bloom in the L28 canal that separates water conservation area 3 and Big Cypress. And between her and Lawrence Glenn, they documented it and made sure everybody was aware of it. I don't know that there's anything that they can do about it, but I'm grateful for the effort they took, and I wanted to make sure I brought that to their attention. Richard Pinsky earlier made some comments as to who was essentially the overall overseer of everything that's happening in the system. And while they're not officially designated, it's important that people understand that large fundraising groups like the Everglades Foundation essentially have control over how the system is being managed currently at every level of the system, from the state government, at the district, DEP, the governor's office. They essentially dictate how things are being managed and how things are being run. And while it's not official, it's really what's happening. Gary Ritter made some comments earlier about nutrients on the lake bottom. I recently read a paper that suggested there's about 13,000 metric tons of phosphorus sitting at the bottom of the lake. I sent you all an email yesterday ahead of this meeting, highlighting some of those issues. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. But it's concerning. It's concerning that nobody's addressing taking all those nutrients that are sitting at the bottom of the lake out, but we're constantly discussing how to keep more from getting in, which is great. Aubrey's comments about mechanical harvest are wonderful, but mechanical harvest also comes with some drawbacks biologically to fish beds, small invertebrates, snakes that live in that vegetation, that when they're removed, essentially they're spraying. Mechanical has its drawbacks too. I thank you all very much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Next is Mike Connor.
Hi, can you, am I coming through okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm Mike Connor, Indian River Keeper over here in Stewart. I make a comment quickly about the lake and about Raymond Iglesias made a comment about his concern earlier in the comment period about the nutrients from mass eradication of invasives on the lake. And we too, in the estuaries, are very concerned about that, because when the discharges do happen, Lake Okeechobee is in our backyard. So we have the same problems with the nutrients, and we're very much concerned about the spraying. I came into the meeting late here today. I had the pleasure of speaking with Eric Sutton at FWC this morning on a Zoom meeting. I'm doing a story for Florida Sportsman coming up shortly on this very subject, because I feel it's an up and front and center environmental problem in the state right now, and has the ear of many, many sportsmen and anglers for good reason. Eric did make a mention. I showed him the slide that you showed earlier in your presentation of the downward trend for the districts, both acreage sprayed and poundage, if I can use that term, of herbicides being used. And his comment was, it's an obvious show that the herbicides and application selectivity of the herbicides have improved dramatically. Maybe staff can comment on that. So he thought it was a good thing, and the trend going downward. On a good note, I was talking to them about the fish sores, about the lesions, about the abnormalities in fish being caught, not just in Okeechobee, but other lakes in the chain of lakes and elsewhere. Kip Frolick did tell me that they are establishing a zone in Lake Okeechobee this month where they're taking 100 acres or so in the Bird Island area to not spray. And basically, I asked him if that could be, if there's a pilot project. And he said that will be a pilot region on Lake Okeechobee to see just what happens without any treatment. And I thought that was a very good idea to do that. And he also said they're going to cage bass in that area, in areas where there's spraying being done and areas where there's no treatment whatsoever. to once and for all put an end to the, the assumptions out there that the fish are being burned, for lack of a better term, by herbicide application. I just wanted to make that comment that I heard that today, and I appreciate your time, and let's hope we get to the bottom of this quickly. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Next is Chris Whitman.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Chris Whitman with Captains for Clean Water. Couple things I wanted to commend you guys on the oversight application efforts with the trackability and the trigger sensors on the applicators' boats and vehicles. I know Francois went over that stuff with us yesterday on the tag meeting as well. And I think that's great. I think it's important to have a component of that for the public to be able to have access readily to that data, and also to get as much out of that as we can. What I mean by that is the ability to have that data uploaded or converted daily into a volume of chemical use, and then also being able to identify and overlay multiple vessels so that we can see, or the district could see, or FWC is able to see, is an area being spot treated effectively, but it's being spot treated by multiple boats in a row. So it's being treated more than it's necessary. But I think it's a great step in the right direction for oversight. That being said, I don't think oversight alone is going to get where we need to be. I think the main focus has to be on every effort to make a reduction in the amount of chemical use and still being able to stay on top of invasive plant management. And I think an important part of that, which a couple of people have brought up, is looking at the cost analysis and ROI of alternative methods as it pertains to nutrient removal and water quality. We have to compare apples to apples there in every benefit that you get out of mechanical harvest versus chemical, and also absolutely have to separate the difference between terrestrial and aquatic vegetation, primarily on the difference in impact that mechanical harvest or spraying has to water quality there. Grasses on a levee or a canal bank being sprayed definitely have a totally different nutrient loading or water quality impact than plants that are within the water that are being treated. So thanks a lot for taking this up. This is a really important issue, and commend you guys for your great work. Thanks a lot.
Next is Travis Thompson.
Hey, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I just wanted to speak for just a minute. Chris was on the tag yesterday as well, and I participate in that, and it's a lot of good stuff. I love seeing what the district's doing, and in concert with FWC, the agency. And I'm one of the more unpopular guys in this conversation because I heard a lot of science. We need to adhere to science, and then we throw away around terms like poisons. These, I think Francois mentioned this, these are registered with the EPA, then they're registered with FDACS, then they're studied based on, what they see, just like Kip and team are doing a lesion study right now. They're looking to even go further, even though that shouldn't have occurred because it's been approved by multiple agencies before it even got to this point. So I think it's great. And I'm a science guy. We just have to be careful with, do we pick science when we want it? I think that's a thing. The other thing I'd like to mention is I've heard several folks mention the FWC plans versus the district's plans. I would like to point out, as a fan of both agencies, FWC is definitely beholden to a different set of stakeholders. And so there's going to be boaters, there's going to be fishermen, there's going to be birders, there's going to be water skiers, there's going to be homeowners. It's a different world that they live in than the district lives in quite a bit. So, and their adherence to public trust doctrine is different. Like the way that they've got to behave within the world of conservation is different. So I think that's an important distinction that you cannot lose in this conversation. Dr. Arrington's comments were spot on. I really like what he had to say. The only question I have in that I'd like to see some further studies or data or science on, because I'm out of my head on this, is if we just do harvesting and put the mass on the banks, the dikes, whatever, we're not really effectively removing the nutrients from those watersheds. And I would like to see us look at the long-term effects of that, and can we remove those nutrients from the watershed? Subsurface lateral flow, nutrient sequestration. There's a lot of questions around that, but I think mechanical harvesting is a wonderful thing. I want to see it work out. I did want to shout out to Raymond Iglesias. A couple of years ago, Raymond was one of the first guys I heard talking about GPS technology and tracking boats, and I think there's been a lot of good work done there. So thank you guys for this meeting. Thank you for doing it through Zoom. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Next, Kelly Ralston.
Thank you. Kelly Ralston with the American Sport Fishing Association. I just wanted to say how much we appreciate the conversation today and for the district's attention to this issue. I know we've talked with several of y'all before and appreciate the highlight here, especially looking at ways to improve plant management and not only just make it better, but also less impactful to state's water quality. I think that's a really important conversation. And it's been encouraging to see the science that's gone into it and kind of the goals and aspirations and alternatives that the district is looking at. And I guess what we would ask is for you to continue to always to look for improvements. And there's always ways to make things better. And we really appreciate the first steps that y'all are considering. One other item that I'd like to highlight is better coordination between state agencies. I know we've talked a lot about U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the district, and DEP. And I think having those conversations and coordination of management across the board is really important in having a good outcome. And lastly, just want to pledge our support in working with you as you move forward to look for those, quote, additional resources, both from the administration and from the legislature. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Next, I have a telephone number ending in 0243. Please unmute.
Thank you. This is Newton Cook. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mr. Cook.
Thank you very much. Great presentations today, guys. And this issue's been around for a long time. I was just looking, and United Waterfowlers put out a position paper on this in 2009. And at that time, we have every one of the problems we have today. Nothing's changed. The United Waterfowlers position, of course, is obviously trying to protect the waterfowl and give them a place to rest and to eat during the winter when they're down here before they go back. And what that requires is submerged aquatic vegetation. And in the case of Florida, a lot of times that's hydrilla. And our position is very simple. We need to maintain at least 30% of our waterways in some form of submerged aquatic vegetation. Nice if it's the natural, but if it's hydrilla, then that's fine. Now, when it comes to the floating vegetation, I've heard every story today that I've heard for the last 10 or 15 years. It's a great dilemma, and I am really understand the difficulties of the people who spray to remove this stuff. I have traveled in places where they don't have the money to spray, and I can assure you, you don't even know there's lakes when you fly over them sometimes. It's literally just a carpet of vegetation and no boat traffic. It's a dilemma, but we must be able to keep our waterways clear and our structures clear. And there's going to have to be spraying. So the dilemma is to change the dynamics of the contracts on the spraying. So it is more for the guy to use less chemicals instead of more. And I keep suggesting that we let contracts go out on maintaining a certain level of submerged and a certain level of floating and a certain level of emergent vegetation in a specific area, a piece of a lake, a whole lake, corner Lake Okeechobee, whatever. And then let the guy bid to maintain that position. So I can only say I have a lot of sympathy for all the people involved in this. I will not join the radicals who say do not spray. We cannot stop it. But I will suggest we do something about changing the dynamics so it's more profitable for the guy to use less poison, and I do call it poison, other than more. And thank you all very much.
Thank you. Next, we have Jeannie Donahue. Ms. Donahue, can you please unmute?
You can hear me now, right?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Fine, thank you very much. I'm from Kissimmee Valley Audubon Society and also a lifelong scholar with the Florida Institute of Technology, specifically the Indian River Lagoon Research Institute. And I'd like to, first of all, commend you guys on an excellent, excellent presentation. It's been A+ ever since you started at 10 p.m. And I have a few comments. I think we've been calling Audubon, specifically Dr. Paul Gray, who is the keeper of Lake Okeechobee, senior scientist on Governor DeSantis's Algae Commission, has been calling for data on where the pesticide applications have been occurring. First of all, I want to commend Francois in your department's efforts to moderate and find out exactly how much application is being done via GPS data. That's most excellent. What we're calling for, Audubon, as far as I know, Audubon, Kissimmee Valley here and Florida in general is calling on data to follow up that in those areas to see the impact on the wildlife, the fish fry, the food for the birds, the amphibians, the quality of the fish, the mutations, possible toxic load of glycophosphates per se. And so we're calling for data to follow the data that you already are gathering on how much is being applied. Well, if people can go back and agree to go back and to examine those places and see the ecological effect exactly of the fish fry, the feeder critters that feed our native birds, and also the effect on our native birds, what disrupts them. And I'm also going to refer you all to Florida Institute of Technology's annual water quality conference coming up in September. It's not to be missed by any of you. And the 40 years of biological research by Elroy Timmer at Aquatic Vegetation Control, who has found a way to incubate bacteria and reduce the nutrient levels without dredging or poisoning. So FIT, Aquatic Vegetation Control, and my time's up. Thank you. Thank you.
Drew, that's it for public commenters.
Thank you. That was a fantastic set of comments. And anyone who has not not had a chance to give us comment or had technical issues, please use the Ask Us button, and we can certainly get back to you and we can receive your comments that way. I have a lot of notes here, a lot of good notes, a lot of consistent themes. And so I look forward to working with staff on going through those and see how we can improve our efforts. I think that based on what I heard, I think Dr. Arrington, you get RAC Member of the Month. I don't promise to give a RAC Member of the Month every month, but it seems like you have a lot of fans out there. Certainly listening to public comment, you have to walk away from this meeting knowing that we have a very intelligent public when it comes to these critical issues. And so I really appreciate everyone's participation. I really want to thank staff at the Water Management District, Francois Leroy and Rich Virgil and all your field operations units who really brainstormed to come up with ideas that we could actually try to execute on this mission. I also want to thank Florida FWC, Fish and Wildlife Commission, for really introducing us to the GPS technology and really helping us with testing that and the whole partnership that we have with them on trying to tackle these public issues. So our next RAC meeting is on Thursday, August 27th, and I really look forward to that engagement. If any RAC member wants to just give me a call anytime to discuss any issues, I'm certainly open to that. But I really appreciate your time today, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.